Good day, everyone. Today we are making a dollhouse stove for the modern farmhouse dollhouse. I cut all the pieces out of black cardstock on my Silhouette Cameo. However, I didn't end up using most of those. The body of it is made out of mat board, which is double laminated, or just maybe single laminated. I glued two pieces together. So I'm just using Well Bond and a thin strip to hold everything together, and then I'm using my washi tape because I couldn't find the painter's tape to hold it while the glue sets. Just applying a thin amount and then straightening everything up, putting it together. So on this front piece here, I did take out too much on the front, like there's that chunk missing. So I decided I better reinforce not just that spot, but the entire thing with some liquid crazy glue. So I hardened it all up with that. Then I glued on the top here and taped it down. And then I took the entire thing and put it under a piece of MDF with some weight on top of it so that it would glue straight. Next, I had to add the little shelves, partitions, whatever, inside the stove. I was originally going to use a single layer of mat board because these don't need to be as thick, but I couldn't find any, so I ended up taking my 110-pound cardstock and I laminated together, I believe, 4 pieces and then pressed them flat while they dried to give me a really good, fairly thick but very strong piece of paper to make the drawers out of. You can see here all of the finished pieces that I've laminated. There is the divide between the drawer in the stove, the drawer in the bottom, and the kick plate part. So I just put it between 2 pieces of MDF and clamped it for half an hour or so for it to harden. Well, that was drying up. I moved on to working on the door. So I reinforced all the edges on this with super glue to make them good and hard, and so that I could easily sand them with this cheap dollar store nail file. These nail files are not great for much of anything except sanding in very small spaces. So I sanded off the burrs, and then I took a large piece of sandpaper and sanded the bottom edge round. So I wanted the bottom edge where it hinges down to be rounded so it would have less problems opening and closing. So I just laid it parallel and scraped towards me. I then took some aluminum foil tape and decided to use that for instant stainless steel. In the end, I didn't love the way it looked. It took a lot of nicks and bumps, but it looked okay. So I just put it on, smoothed it over with a piece of spare mat board, and then rounded the edges onto the back, smoothing and trimming as I go. I cut out the inside. I cut a 45-degree angle on the corners and then cut the bulk out of the center, rounded over all the corners, and pressed it down. It did end up leaving like a lot of gaps, so I had to fix those later. I ended up having a lot of gaps and spaces where the tape didn't meet up, especially on the inside of the door. So I decided to cut small strips and pray that they weren't too highly visible. So I cut off some small strips, lined them up, pressed them on, and smoothed it over with my bone folder or mat board. It actually ended up working pretty well. I was actually pretty impressed at how seamless it was. The tape really folds in on itself quite well. So as a method, it does work, but as a finished product, you'll see later, it's very dented. So I guess it's an okay method. If I were to redo it, I would probably not do it the same, but at this point, I was unwilling to remake this. For the glass inside the stove door, I took some overhead transparency, the plain acetate one, not the one that you can run through the printer. It has a texture on it. And I trimmed it to size. I then glued it down using some hot glue. I also then glued on my ribbon hinges at the bottom and then covered all of that up with an inside trim piece in black cardboard, or cardstock, I guess. I did have to end up using my knife to kind of like cut off globs of hot melt glue. I don't love hot melt glue. I have a whole rant about it if you want to hear it someday. But it was the only thing I could think of using that would hold the acetate down. So finally those interior portion pieces were dry, so it was time to fit them in. I was contemplating what kind of glue to use. Like I said previously, I hate hot melt glue in most situations, so I decided I was going to tack it in with super glue for the middle one there. And it works pretty good. This is the gel super glue. It's a lot thicker and I find it a little more flexible. It doesn't break as much. And then I used a little bit of the well bond on the bottom to reinforce it and make sure it had a really good flexible long-term hold. For this bottom partition, I really wanted to make sure it lined up as straight as possible because there was going to be a drawer that slid in and out, so I wanted to try to make sure it was level and flush with the top so that the drawer could slide without a lot of issues. I decided in the end that I was going to use hot melt glue, so I twiddled my thumbs while I waited for it to heat up, and it was finally ready to go. I glued it on with hot glue because it's fast, it's relatively strong, it provides good structure, and nobody could see where it was going. Big chunks didn't matter. I then glued on my toe kick, which was a little long and I'd trim off later. So for the next few clips, you're going to notice that there's no back on the top of the stove where the dials are. I didn't like the way the original one was looking. It looked uneven and not quite big enough, so I cut it off, made this one out of 4 thicknesses of mat board. But that was definitely far too chunky and still not tall enough, so I scrapped it. I will put another one on later. I moved to doing the interior pieces that would hold the racks in. I ended up not being able to remove the racks because the mat board on the front was too thick, but this still gave me good place to put the racks and have good spacing. So I just lined them all up, made sure they were good, pulled them out, and then used PVA glue and clamps on the inside to hold them all down. Next, it came time to making said racks. I used some paper clips I had in my office that I had to strip a plastic coating on and cut them down to size. I have to note that I am not good at soldering. This is maybe my second attempt ever. My third arm thing I have there doesn't actually have any hands on it, so it's not like I could use it to hold pieces. I ended up having to jerry-rig it with my tweezers and kind of clamping it down. You can see some of the different methods I use. Things would move, things would pop off. I am by no means an expert at this, but in the end they actually turned out pretty good. I tried to just take my time when I was soldering and go slow. There was a lot of big chunks and the wires overhung, but I was planning on taking care of that later. And yes, at some point I did have an accident and touched my bare finger to the soldering barrel and had a very large scar on the back of my knuckle for several days. So going forward, you might see a band-aid on my ring finger on my right hand. That is the consequence of using a soldering gun. I wasn't being precise when I was measuring any of this out, so for the second one I simply just laid it beside the first one and tried to line up the bars as close as possible to make it look like a set. The wire is quite bumpy still. I need to get some sort of straighteners to straighten paper clips in the future, but it wasn't terrible. I had to then take some wire snippers and snip off all the ends. I then took the solder gun to try to melt down any large globs, as well as when I was cutting off some small end pieces, some of them came loose, so I did end up having to resolder my solders in some spots. You can see there, one of them just full on fell off. On to other things, I was still unable to find single mat board, so I laminated together pieces of my cardstock to make the bottom drawer sides, front and bottom. So I just spread the glue out, laminated them together, clamped like I did previously, and here I am just assembling the pieces to make the frame of the drawer. While I waited for that to dry, I decided to glue on the top. This is a piece I had designed in silhouette, and then I used my white gel pen to draw the circles on the cardstock, cut it out, so I just glued that on top. Wait for that to dry. I then decided that the transparency glass was just too transparent. It was kind of weird being able to see into an oven. So I decided that I needed to tint the glass. So I ended up using some UV resin and a little bit of black alcohol ink, and I just mixed it up and then put it into the transparency part. The first time I made it, I kind of went not like dark enough. It was just still too clear. So I did darken it up a bit. In the end, it ended up a little dark. It's pretty much black. I should have just been a little easier on it. But I just put the resin in, spread it out with the popsicle stick, and then I took my UV torch to it to harden it. I also decided that the top to the stove needed to be glossy and I was going to resin it. So I decided to use the tinted one because I thought it would look really good with it like a little bit duller, because on my stove at least the circles are not completely white. So I used the tinted stuff to do that, and then I smoothed it over with a rubber spatula that is only for crafts, and try to get it very flat. I flashlighted everything to harden it. I don't know about everyone else, but I find that the flashlight never quite gets everything 100% cured, so I do have to take it out into the sun the next day. The grain in the paper really popped on the stovetop. So I did end up having to sand it down a little bit and put a couple more coats of resin on. The next ones were just clear to get it nice and smooth. So for the handle on the stove, I decided to use paper, which I'm not sure why. I think I was just in a paper state of mind. I cut some narrow strips and then glued 2 of them together to form the body of the handle, taped it over top of this bone folder, and then cut a 3rd piece to reinforce the middle. The problem with paper is that it can warp, that when you start laminating layers, you can get gaps, and the edges don't always line up right, so they kind of look a little messy. For the fridge, which is also going in the kitchen, I ended up making them out of polymer clay. I do worry about those because it's more flexible, so I'm not loving either of these solutions. I did reinforce these with super glue to make them very hard. When it came to installing these, I first tried using sewing pins, but ended up not being strong enough. So I made my holes with the sewing pins, and then ended up taping off the front with washi tape so I could draw on it, marked out where my holes were, and then ended up using tiny little brass brad nails that I think maybe came from a dollhouse stuff, or maybe just random hardware I have laying around, and I ended up hammering those into the drawer fronts. I did have to cut them quite a bit shorter, but in the end it worked out. They are on there pretty well. Next, you're going to see some footage of it pretty much done. I went ahead and painted all of the interior black. I lost some footage, which you should all be incredibly grateful for, because there was over 2.5 hours of footage in making this thing, and trying to cut it all down is still a challenge for me. So I lost the footage of painting the inside of it black. I also made a little number clock thing for the back of the stove. I made that on my silhouette using vinyl. I did a layer of black, and then I think I actually did a layer of green, and then I cut the numbers out of the black, stuck the black over top of the green. So it's on the back. I made the little knobs on the top using polymer clay, and I stuck a magnet on the inside of the drawer, well, the outside of the drawer, inside the cabinet and on the back of the drawer, so that the drawer would magnet into place and hold. And I did end up ordering some tiny magnets online and gluing them on the oven door so that it would hold shut. I got tiny little ones, and they work okay. So this is a finished stove. It has the magnet at the back of the drawer and in the back for it to close, and then a small magnet on the door and a large one up in this corner for it to hold. I didn't paint the sides because they're going to be, I'm going to glue all of the cabinets and appliances in. That is going to go